Thank you for that kind introduction. I want to thank the Federation for hosting this gathering and this opportunity for me to share some thoughts with you all. And thank Mark Feldweis, who was very helpful in bringing this about. And I want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. This is arguably, certainly one of the most, and perhaps the most important issue facing the United States today. And as many of you know, I've spoken out and written about this topic for some time now, going back several years. I have previously warned about the dangers to America, our allies, and our interests, the dangers that arise from the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is not a topic that's new to me. I've also long supported the strongest possible sanctions. I wish that the sanctions had gone into effect earlier. I wish that they had been stronger. But I do know that the sanctions that were finally imposed had a powerful effect on the Iranian economy. In fact, so powerful that they brought Iran to the negotiating table, a place that the Iranians did not want to be. For many months now, I've been skeptical about the president's approach to the negotiations with Iran. It has seemed to me that we were holding all the cards, but we played our hand as though it were a very weak hand. Nevertheless, if the president had succeeded in achieving the goals that he had stated, then the product of the negotiation might very well have been worth supporting. The president's very often stated goals, after all, were the complete elimination of an Iranian nuclear weapons program, to prevent Iran from ever being able to obtain nuclear weapons, an inspection system that would be robust enough to detect any Iranian cheating, and in return for those things, if they were to be achieved, then the United States would end sanctions, bring Iran into the world community, and hopefully in the process change Iranian attitudes towards the United States. Now, I still would have wanted Iranian commitments to halt their active support and funding of terrorist activities, and I would have wanted them to free the American hostages that they're holding. But if the president's stated goals had been achieved, then it would have been a deal worth supporting. Well, I've taken the last 17 days since the deal was announced to study it very, very carefully. I think to fully understand this agreement, we have to look at both the details of the agreement itself, but also the context in which we're entering into this agreement potentially. So let me talk a little bit about the context as I see it. First, we've got a lengthy and substantial history with Iran. Unfortunately, it's not good. Iran has been extremely hostile to the United States for decades now. Many of us are old enough to remember 36 years ago when Iranian students, encouraged by Ayatollah Khomeini, stormed the U.S. Embassy, took over the embassy, captured and took 52 Americans hostage, and held those Americans hostage for 444 days. Our relationship with Iran has really not improved that much since then. They're still holding American hostages as we gather here today. They've killed over 500 American troops in Iraq and Afghanistan by creating very sophisticated IEDs that they manufactured and planted where they would do the most harm to Americans. They regularly call for death to America. The Iranian regime leadership continues to refer to us as the Great Satan. Second thing I think we ought to bear in mind in this context is the demonstrated aggression that they have shown in their region. This country is, after all, the world's #1 supporter of terrorism. They have actively supported Hezbollah and actively, aggressively supported Assad while he massacres hundreds of thousands of his own people. Iran started a civil war in Yemen because they didn't like the fact that the government in Yemen was cooperating with the United States. And of course, they continue to routinely and emphatically threaten Israel's very existence. I would also argue that this is a regime that's extremely untrustworthy. they're in open violation of over 20 international agreements that they have committed to. They were caught trying to buy nuclear parts while these very negotiations were underway. They were recently caught again using Hezbollah to supply arms to Assad in open violation of UN resolutions. The bottom line is this regime in Iran cannot be trusted. And finally, and I think this might be the most important point about the context of this agreement, it seems to me in all of my experience in business and elsewhere, and whether it's negotiating a business transaction or negotiations between countries, a document that attempts to codify an agreement can work if there's been a meeting of the minds. Both parties actually want a particular outcome. Then you can document the process by which you get to it with some confidence that it'll work. But there has to be an agreement on fundamental objectives. Let me give an example. Case of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Now, I think we can all agree that Muammar Gaddafi was a very bad guy. There's no doubt in my mind. But Gaddafi saw what we did in Iraq. And when the Bush administration confronted him with the intelligence they had on his program to develop nuclear weapons, Gaddafi made a decision. His decision was his hold on power was safer if he didn't have nuclear weapons and have to worry about an American attack than his grip on power would be if he continued to pursue weapons. That didn't make him a good guy. He was still a bad guy, but he came to a rational and sincere conclusion based on his perception of his own self-interest. And as a result, we were able to reach an agreement by which his nuclear weapons program came to an end. And nobody doubts that that was the case. I'm convinced that the Iranian regime has come to no such conclusion. In fact, I don't think there's any evidence at all that they actually intend to abandon the pursuit of nuclear weapons. In fact, quite the contrary. The very demands that the Iranian regime insisted upon in this agreement, I think, clearly point to the fact that they intend to continue to pursue the development and the acquisition of nuclear weapons. So to summarize this context, it seems to me when we're dealing with a country that has been and continues to be extremely hostile to the United States and our allies and our interests, when we're dealing with a country that is aggressively seeking to dominate its region, when we're dealing with a country that is fundamentally and repeatedly untrustworthy, when we're dealing with a country that shows no intent to abandon its pursuit of nuclear weapons, then in that context, I think it's very, very difficult to complete an acceptable negotiation to keep such a country nuclear free. So I've reviewed this deal. We've had 17 days since the documentation has been made available to members of Congress. I've read the language. I've studied this deal extensively. I have looked at the classified material. I've had numerous briefings. I have consulted with experts, listened to the testimony, and I've concluded that these negotiations have let down the American people. This deal fails to meet the minimum criteria we need to remove sanctions on this regime. And rather than enhancing America's national security interest, in fact, this deal threatens it. I do not support this deal. I will vote for a resolution of disapproval of this deal, and I will attempt to persuade my colleagues to do likewise. I have many, many specific concerns about the details of this agreement. I want to focus on 6 of them. There are many more, but there are 6 that I think are most compelling and should make the case for why we should reject this deal. First and foremost, this agreement releases over $100 billion in sanctioned Iranian money to the regime almost immediately. The deal removes the economic sanctions within months, long before Iran could have complied with the full terms of the agreement. The first round of sanctions are scheduled to be removed in October. More follow shortly thereafter. In my view, the removal of the sanction should occur only after Iran has complied with all of the terms that they are supposed to be subject to. In fact, the removal of the sanction should occur only after Iran dismantles its nuclear program. In fact, under this agreement, Iran never has to dismantle its nuclear program. So these many tens of billions of dollars are going to go to this regime, which will undoubtedly use some of that money to increase funding for terrorist activity, because that's what they do. And it's not just my speculation. The President's National Security Advisor, Susan Rice, admitted that some of the money will be used to continue Iran's bad behavior in the region. Two examples that are obvious: rockets in Lebanon and Gaza, and targeting Israeli and Jewish interests all around the world, maybe as far away as Argentina. The nominee for Vice Chairman of Joint Chiefs, Air Force General Paul Seller, said that sanctions relief is extremely dangerous and will fund terrorism. And once Iran has the money, it no longer has any incentive to comply with its obligations under this agreement. What it's in this for is the money. And under this agreement, they get the money up front. Second big concern that I have: this agreement allows Iran to maintain an industrial-scale uranium enrichment program. The capabilities all remain intact. Iran claims that this enrichment is for peaceful purposes. Now, putting aside how implausible it is that a country that is completely awash with oil and natural gas needs to have a nuclear-powered electric generation, if you believed that that was the intent of the Iranians with respect to this nuclear program, then why wouldn't Iran follow what 18 other countries around the world have done, which is to have electricity generated by nuclear power where they purchase the enriched uranium from other countries? That would be available to Iran. But instead, Iran has insisted, and they've been granted, the ability to retain a domestic indigenous enrichment capability. In fact, they'll be able to keep over 6,000 centrifuges, over 5,000 of them operational. They'll be able to keep facilities at Fordo as a research facility where their centrifuges will be spinning. They'll be able to keep facilities at Iraq, and they'll redesign and update the heavy water reactor they have there. Advanced nuclear research for the purpose of developing ever more sophisticated centrifuges is permitted to continue. And that brings me to number 3. In light of the context that I mentioned earlier, it would seem to me that an inspection and verification regime is absolutely essential, that it be completely bulletproof, to have any hope that this agreement could reach what it purports to seek. In fact, the enforcement and verification is extremely dubious. Let me give some examples. First of all, the agreement subcontracts out the essential enforcement mechanisms to the IAEA. This is the same IAEA that Iran has continually ignored for years. Iran has not allowed the inspectors to visit certain sites. Iran has misled the inspectors from the IAEA on previous trips and harassed them. The IAEA has stated that they have been unable to do their job properly because of the way Iran obfuscates. And Iran doesn't even have to fully disclose all of its previous nuclear activities. So despite the promise of anytime, anywhere inspections, there's nothing of the sort. Iran will have at least 24 days from the time that an infraction has been discovered to the time that an inspection can occur. At least 24 days. There's an elaborate process, but inspectors will only be able to even request a visit to an undeclared site when they have evidence that they have to submit to Iran. With, by the way, a disclosure of the sources and methods by which they obtained it. That's just to get the clock started. And then there are a series of these negotiations that can occur between Iran and the IAEA, between the Joint Commission and others, followed by a period where Iran gets 3 additional days. It all adds up to 24 days. And that assumes that all players comply with all deadlines. Now let's just think about this. How much can be covered up in 24 days? I would suggest quite a lot. But there are other huge problems with the enforcement regime that's contemplated. First of all, there are 2 side agreements that are incorporated into the overall deal that we haven't seen. They deal with Iran's past nuclear activities and the mechanism by which future inspections will occur. These are agreements negotiated between Iran and the IAEA, and we're not a part of those agreements. Not only are we not a part of those agreements, we haven't seen them. And when I say we, I don't mean just Congress. John Kerry acknowledges he has not seen these agreements. We don't know the nature or the extent of Iran's previous nuclear activity. We don't know whether it's adequately documented so that the IAEA will be able to figure out where they're picking up and plowing new ground versus what's already been done. We don't know the terms of the inspection regime, and neither does anybody in our government. Another concern that I have about the enforcement of this, the agreement explicitly states that if the United States reimposes any nuclear sanctions for any reason, Iran is relieved of all commitments under the deal. Let me restate that. If the United States comes to the conclusion that any of the nuclear sanctions that we have had in force need to be reimposed for any reason whatsoever, Iran can walk away from the deal. So let's think about what the implications of this are. Let's say that Iran is in clear, unambiguous violation of the agreement. Let's say we discover this, it's documented. Now let's say the EU, the Russians, the Chinese, everyone agrees. There's no doubt, there's no question, Iran is in violation of the agreement. If we then decide to restore some of the nuclear sanctions in proportion to the magnitude of the violation, it stipulates in the agreement that Iran can walk away and all future obligations are over. This is on paragraph 37, page 20. You can look this up, and I will in fact quote the operative part. It says, the agreement acknowledges, and I quote, Iran has stated that if sanctions are reinstated in whole or in part, Iran will treat that as grounds to cease performing its commitments under this JCPOA in whole or in part. So now let's think about this. What is the dynamic that this creates? Right? We have an administration that has told us repeatedly that the only alternative to this deal is war.
That's right.
That's what they have said.
That's right.
So, if we discover a violation, and we start to think, well, maybe we need to reimpose some sanctions, what other enforcement mechanism is there? I think I know what the Iranians are going to say. They're going to take out the agreement, and they're going to turn to page 20, paragraph 37, and say, if you do that, we're out of here. Well, if the administration believes the only alternative to this agreement is war, and they don't want to pursue a war, then they're not going to enforce a violation. My fear is they will look the other way. What kind of enforcement is that? This means the whole idea of snapback sanctions is a fantasy. There's the fourth big problem that I have with this agreement. It's temporary. It's only 10 years at most. And many of the essential provisions are only 8 years. The fact is, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu was right when he said that this deal won't block Iran's path to a nuclear weapon, it paves their path to a nuclear weapon. A decade from now, if the Iranians were to fully comply with every detail in this agreement, they'd be within weeks of having a nuclear weapon. And there's no linkage whatsoever between Iran's behavior anywhere in the world and the removal of all of these limits that are contemplated in the agreement. By the way, also, as we discovered very, very late in the negotiating process, completely unrelated sanctions that deal with conventional weapons embargo that has been in force for 8 years, 9 years, those are lifted. Those are lifted in 5 years. similar decades-old ballistic missile embargo, that's lifted after 8 years, and research is allowed